My name is John Mutua. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs, the programs coordinator, and I also head the program on public finance management. So today we have two of my colleagues, Kwame Owino, the Chief Executive of IEA Kenya, and Leo Kembe, who works in the Constitution Law and Economy program, who will be speaking to the topic on is debate on basic education about sustainability or the cost of government. But before I start, so basically, on just a quick background, which obviously will be shared by the two speakers, we are aware that the debate on school capitation or capitation for basic education has gathered pace, and it's been quite contentious. And there are questions around whether the debate is well grounded, or so there are issues around whether it's been politicized more than it should be, and whether the actual facts are being presented, among other things. So there's that question about the framing of the debate on basic education. So my two colleagues, starting with Leo, will obviously speak to these issues, and we hope that by the time they're done with the presentation, they'll be able to ground this debate that has really gathered pace. So of course, without preempting what they will be going into, I will we'll start with Kemboi, and then of course Kwame will pick up from where Kemboi lives.
Thank you, John. So we are discussing this question about sustainability with the basic education, because it emanated from parliamentary inquiry when members of parliament were probing the cabinet secretary for national treasury to explain why exchequer delays related to capitation and generally, and in doing so, the cabinet secretary national treasury made a claim that secondary education, provision of secondary education is unsustainable as it is today, and there is a need to review the reason why. So we want to ask a question, and that's why we crafted this question. We now want to look at the constitutional arguments, the economics of education, but generally, why is the CS making those comments now, and where the lay of the land is, and explain. Now, the first part is for us to frame the policy problem, which is what the cabinet secretary said regarding free secondary education, and looking at numbers. We'll look at what the Constitution says about this, and also evaluate the problem, provide a conceptual understanding of the problem, which is whether is it a cost of education problem or it's a fiscal crisis, and then give key messages in form of policy messages. So generally, for any public finance management system, what should be the funding priorities? As you all know, Chapter 12 of the Constitution, from Article 201, provides the basis for public finance management. But again, Article 95 on the role of National Assembly, Article 96 on the role of the Senate, and also Article 94 on the role of Parliament, provides and subsequently, Article 220 on the form, timing, and contents of the budgets provides Parliament with powers of the past, making Parliament the one that makes decisions on what is considered funded and what is considered unfunded. So Parliament is and that's why they are required to provide public participation and in doing so. What we've done here is to provide a summative view as economists, as the Institute of Economic Affairs, on what is funded. So what is funded generally is public goods and constitutional obligations. What determines those funding priorities? Public goods, and the specific reason is that public goods generally can only be provided by government because the marginal cost is higher, tends to be higher than marginal benefit, and that's why private sector involvement in that area tends to be a little bit problematic. The second part is constitutional obligations. Constitutional obligations is the Constitution predetermines some of those things to be considered as first priority and considered as discretionary. I can give two examples. One of them is, for example, the Constitution determined that all sovereign loans owned by government of Kenya are first charged on the consolidated fund, or are first charged on revenues. So the Constitution already predetermined that, and that is something that no matter notwithstanding the convention and other things, you can't change. The second question is now the Article 53 rights, and one of them being education. So if you look at Article 53, 1B, it provides that every child has a right to free and compulsory basic education. So two things. There's a right to a free education, and on the second part, compulsory, meaning that a child can't opt out. And so what does that mean? One, it requires universal access, and basic education now is primary and high school education. That has to be free, that has to be compulsory. That is a requirement, that the minimum level of education that the Constitution anticipated is not less than basic education. And that required that no child should be denied enrollment due to fees, disability, location, parental status, or documentation. Notwithstanding, no issue, whether administrative, procedural, whether economic, whether social, none whatsoever is now would require to impede that right. Two, compulsory attendance. Government must enforce compulsory school attendance and prevent questions about dropout, whether it's child labor or early marriage. Basic education must be publicly funded and prioritized in national and county budgets. And that's why, if you look at the Schedule 4 on division of how functions were divided, county governments owned what you call the early childhood education, while national government are responsible for both basic and tertiary education. So that required that basic education is already, since it's already spoken for, must be prioritized for the same. And then free and compulsory basic education, that this is a mass product, that part of it will now require guaranteeing adequate staff, infrastructure, learning materials, and also measurable outcomes. Measurable outcomes for those who understand education is retention, achievement, enrollment, tracking all those questions. What affects if you are in a if for those what are equity questions? All those outcomes that inform policy. Now, just to provide context, in the Economic Survey 2025, the number that provided for primary school children is 8.2 million. For JSS, the junior secondary, it's 2.5 million, while there are 4.3 million children in secondary schools. So almost 6 million, slightly above 6 million, and in secondary, both senior and JSS. On the other hand, the others are 8.2 in primary. So total of close to 16 million children go to school on a daily basis, and this makes it one of the largest, single largest public services provided. I don't think there is any other public service that is provided daily by government of Kenya than matches something like this. Something like this. Now, we need to also provide what is the state of play. What is happening? So there's in measuring outcomes, there's what we call the learning adjusted years of schooling, which is the LAYS. Kenya, as the highest LAYS in sub-Saharan Africa. Children projected to complete 12 years of learning adjusted years of schooling compared to the regional average of 8 years. However, when you break down that number, you find that while the national average is huge, there is significant inequity. So, for example, for Nairobi students, they complete almost 12 learning years, adjusted years of schooling. But Garissa have fewer than 5, and many other counties. So there is what we call the lagging counties, counties that have fewer years. So there's a bigger, also from the data, a number of those counties that are considered with fewer LAYS, the learning adjusted years of schoolings, are in ASAL and other counties that are not that are affected predominantly by other questions. The second part is, if you look at the lagging counties, the national average for net enrollment, primary net enrollment, is 86.2%. However, for lagging counties, the average is 63.2. So there's a gap of almost 23 points between the national average and the lagging counties. So there are counties that have made so much progress that have pushed the national average higher, while there are fewer counties, there are other counties that are lagging, and the difference is significant. For lagging counties, secondary school net enrollment is very low. The national average is 48.8, while the lagging counties for secondary is 26.5. That is close to 22, a gap of 22.3. So you realize something. Net enrollment for primary is significant, but for high schools, it's 48%. So it's less than what is already there. So that if, for example, the 30 if the primary school net enrollment was to match the secondary school net enrollment, instead of 6 million children, instead of 6 million children in secondary schools, you'll be seeing something close to 10 million children. So there are other questions about gender disparities. Severe for children, for girls in lagging counties, and gaps, and those is also compounded by geographic and economic inequalities. And then there is also belt-based inequities, where income disparities now are bigger when at secondary school level, and they start to widen even further that as they go to tertiary education. And that is a problem for income mobility. So it means that some of the people who proceed, if you look at income deciles, are some of the richest households, Kenyans from richest households, actually proceed to tertiary education. Now, there is economic basis for why investment must be done in the in education sector. So there are two prominent economists. One of them called Paul Romer, who won a Nobel Prize in 2019, and then there's another economist called Lucas. So and they actually looked at economic growth and discovered that some of those economies have a different way, have better things in what we call technology diffusion. They are very innovative, and innovation is the way to do things. But if you look again at some of those economies in terms of producing not just higher education achievement across across the entire education system, from basic education all the way to tertiary, and produced what we know now as the basis. So while education is not a public good, it's a private good, but with positive spillovers. So with positive externalities. And one of them is productivity spillover. Human capital enhances aggregate output beyond and that output, and total factor, and it's a major factor in enhancing total factor productivity. Second issue is now the way it promotes technology diffusion and innovation. And those two papers give us evidence that education was a central driver in sustained income per capita growth for those economies that became newly industrialized. And then it improves intertemporal income mobility and reduces income inequality. So we have some data from KIBIS, Kenya Integrated Housing Budget Survey, that actually showed when an household jumps, when you, from no education, surveyed people with no education, for those with primary education, secondary, diploma, degree, and now master's and PhD, there was significant income difference when you immediately between those who do not have education, and once they attain, they go to primary. So and that shows that intertemporal income mobility is real, and from the housing survey. So it was dated data from 2015-16, and even still that data will not show anything different, but it still shows those significant differences. Another thing is marginal returns are higher among low-income households, which shows subsequently the fiscal incidence data. Better labor market efficiency. There are also other fiscal and social externalities related to improved. So there's sound economics on why government should invest in education. Now we have to show data, because Mbadi's claim was around sustainability, and sustainability has to come from the budget. So if you look at the education sector as a share of budget, it was in the financial year that just ended, it was 29% of the entire budget, 676 billion shillings. And that is combines from basic education all the way to tertiary education. And it's slightly, as a share of budget, slightly dropped to 28%, but on a nominal basis, it went up to 702 billion shillings. But education is not among it's the largest single ticket item, but it's compared to, it's not the only thing that is larger in Kenya's budget. There are other energy infrastructure and ICT, public administration structure, governance, justice, and national security. But if we combine the security sector, it's around the entire part is around 21%. So it's still a single ticket item. But again, we have to bring that number to closer. The main argument from CS Treasury was around capitation. So, and this is the structure of capitation that as it was. For primary school, it's 1,420. For junior second JSS, it's 15,000. And now the capitation where there was a problem was secondary education. Where there is a problem, the CS, there was a reduction from 22,000 to 16,000. And the CS gave arguments why similar for 22,000, why it's inefficient to have it at 22,000. But now we need to look at numbers clearly. So if you look at, so if you, the education sector has the entire 28% of the budget that you saw, the 702, is divided into 4 aggregates. One being basic education, the second one being teacher service commission, higher education and research, and then the fourth one is vocational and technical training. So the single largest item in the education sector is wages, and those wages go to teacher service commission. If you compare all of them together, for basic education, it comes to something like 12 billion shillings every month, and for teacher service commission, it's almost close to 1 billion shillings for every day, something like 900 million every day. So, and these are, you all know that there's a reason why you see there's a reason why you see the budget structure as it is, partly because teachers, the jobs are permanent, on a permanent basis. Secondly, a stronger union power for teacher service, for the teacher service commission. But third, that Kenya is a child-rich population, and hence there'll be a larger number of, at this time of demographic transition, of Kenya's demographic transition, there'll be a larger number of children going to school. So you'd need more teachers to attend to. But we'll raise a question about why that bigger bill for teachers. So when you compare the entire outlay compared to each other, you realize that for the education, for TSC, the number jumped up by almost 2.7% between 23-24 financial year and 24-25 financial year. Secondly, you also realize that the budget line for basic education slightly dropped by 0.5%, and has stagnated within the entire period within those 3 years that we surveyed. And then you realize that also for higher education, it slightly dropped by from 15.6 to 13.8% as a share of the budget. So it shows you that only vocational and technical training grew by a smaller amount, and the TSC being the larger beneficiary. a beneficiary of that, a beneficiary of that. Now, so the Auditor General also evaluated this question of budgets, and looking at the capitation, and looking at not just at capitation alone, but other requirements under the education program. So this a specialized audit on capitation, and they realized that part of in specific financial years, within from 2020-21 to, and these numbers are nominal to 23-24, there was a requirement of 419 billion shillings for 419 billion shillings. And that what was approved within the same period was 334 billion shillings. And you look at the under-allocation on the last bar, ranging from 639 million for primary to the highest, which was the 23-24 of which was the lowest in 23-24 to 2.1 billion in 21-22. This is just after the aftermath of COVID. And you see that similarly, except for secondary school, the disparity has grown. It was 10.5 billion in 2020-21, and that has grown to what is an underallocation of something like of 31.7 billion shillings. So the takeaway from this, unless outside before we evaluate the efficiency question, before an evaluation of efficiency question, it shows that basically that there was a rationing. So the CS Treasury's argument on sustainability is real, and this is where it shows, because if government cannot meet that requirement, it essentially shows that some services are overlooked. Now, fiscal incidence is an economist's clever term for showing which is the most effective expenditure when government deploys it. And this is from a World Bank's evaluation, the Public Expenditure Review 2025. You see that fiscal incidence, the two expenditure lines, education and health, especially, but the one with the largest form of to the poor. And you see the decile of pre-fiscal income, and you see a percentage on the other side is education and healthcare, and education and healthcare, and also direct transfers have the most. So this is have the most fiscal incidence. This is proof of the ones that actually expenditures that matter to Kenyans who come from low-income backgrounds. So I want to leave at that, and then welcome Kwame to make the second part of the presentation, which is why now? Why is the CS Treasury making these comments on the sustainability of secondary education? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Leo. Good morning, everyone. Now, this our task today was basically to explain four things. One, to start with an explanation of what the right to education in Kenya means. And our claim is that it's on the basis of that right to education, leaving aside the economic justification, upon which the budgeting and appropriations are made by Parliament to fund education. And remember, Article 57, which my colleague Leo spoke to, talks about the right to free basic education, right? Free and compulsory basic education, meaning that Parliament, the Treasury, the Executive, and all arms of government will not treat education funding, especially basic education funding, as discretionary spending, because already the Constitution commands that funding be made available. So that's a first thing. So flexibility around funding of education does not exist for Kenya's government, regardless of what other pressures it may have. And in a way, so that was the first point. The second point is that we were then answering the question about what's the economics of education, and we've spoken about the fact that, yes, in addition to the fact that government is justified to fund certain things which, because of the nature of those industries or sectors, would not be adequately or efficiently provided to the private sector, Kenya's education has almost been placed at the same level as public goods, even if obviously it does not qualify as public good, but it has enormous social and economic externalities which justify education policy being elevated. So that's part was, then we went into the numbers, and we had one thing that says the fiscal incidence of funding, public sector funding of education falls disproportionately high, disproportionately on lower income groups, with the lowest decile, which is the lowest, or the least, the least, or the poorest decile of Kenyans, the poorest 10% of Kenyans, are appropriating 30% of all public sector education spending. And the argument Leo is making with that is, therefore, it proves that education is fairly redistributed, and actually it is designed in a way that ensures that those who are least able to afford it, or rather the lowest income households, generate or appropriate most of the public spending, which tells you something about the equity consideration. So it's a fairly decent method for achieving equity in public expenditure, which, as you can see, is not the same for all government programs. And then we went into the distribution of education and seen that about 15 million, slightly less than 1/3 of the Kenyan population, basically 30% of the Kenyan population, gets up every day and attends school in a primary or secondary school or high school setting, most of which these facilities are provided by government. So when we see the numbers, we looked at the Auditor General, and it's shown that there's systematically been underfunding of education, coming to about 680 million in the year that was last tested for, in 2022 and 2023. We probably think that drift has continued, which shows that the problem that the Cabinet Secretary is speaking about is not a problem that started yesterday. There's been systematic underfunding of education. And the reason we mention this is because the Constitution does not allow for discretion in basic education. We can talk about we can talk about tertiary education a little later. And then when we've seen the distribution of the budgets for education, I think we need to correct it. When Leo presented that government spends 29% of the budget on education, that's the executive budget, government's budget. So if you put together the budget for counties and you add it to that, the budgets for the judiciary and the legislature, it comes down usually to about 22, 23%. So that's an important point to bear in mind. But on the whole, we've seen its distribution across the country fairly decent, but when you see the budget distribution within the education ministry or the education sector in general, two things have emerged. One, basic education is fairly static in terms of what share of the allocation, but the amount that goes over to teachers and the TSC specifically to pay teachers. So in other words, the capitation is frozen, but payment for teachers has been going ahead. Now, whether that benefits kids or not is a different matter altogether. But yes, it's one of the things to show that even when government puts in more money into education, or rather funds education, through appropriations enabled by Parliament, most of it goes to the payment of teachers. And that brings us to the question about, fine, it looks like in the competition for capitation grants, the TSC representing teachers who respond through unions seem to be appropriating a bigger share of any increments, and those are the facts. Now let's ask ourselves: so when all this happens, why is it now that Cabinet Secretary Mbadi, or he and his colleagues, seem to be trying to get us back to the numbers and say that, look, education is unsustainable? And remember, our claim at the Institute of Economic Affairs, again, based on the constitutional requirements, is Parliament appropriates budgets by allocating, and the executive executes. So we've seen this part between the cabinet secretary and his colleagues in the legislature saying that, look, this is not unfunded and this program is unaffordable. Now, what Leo has told us is that there's been systematic underfunding based on the benchmark, which is basically the constitutional requirement that every child be provided with free, compulsory, and basic education, which is all high school and everything going back down, all the way to primary schools, because early childhood education is supported through the grants and the institutions of the county government. So now we are asking ourselves, then why now? What's special about this moment? Now, what is the problem? And let's start with the fact that government funds its operations in two ways. One, through revenues, and then the expenditure. And we've told you that education takes 29%, 28% of spending by the national executive, and that comes to about usually 22 or 23% of the expenditure of the total government. But what we are seeing here is a trend line over almost 15 years, telling us what the revenue trends have been and the expenditure trends. So the expenditure is the orange line at the top, and the blue line tells you what the revenue. And the gap between them tells us what the fiscal policy, or rather what the fiscal deficit has been over that time. So you can tell that expenditure has been above and actually growing at a much higher rate that revenues have been growing. This is not to show revenues are growing, are not. As you can tell, it's been in the 16 to 18% range. And over that 15-year period, it's actually grown by close to 2 percentage points higher than it was in 2011. And we've taken this just for illustrative purposes, but we wanted to cover sufficiently large number of years, 15 years, close to a generation, so that we can illustrate this point specifically. So the first thing you can see here is that the expenditures are higher than the revenues are, but the expenditures are happening regardless. So that's the first thing to note. As we go forward, it is telling us that the government of Kenya is facing some fiscal distress, which is what Cabinet Secretary Mbadi was alluding to. But let's look at the numbers to confirm whether that is really true. Now, what you can see here is total revenue and grants growing by 7.8%, or 8%, if you see the second row from the top. On the revenue side, part A, so basically revenues are growing by an average of 8.1%, discretionary expenditure growing by 10.5%, right? So that, of course, widens the deficit. But if you look at the non-discretionary expenditure, which is that expenditure for which government has no control, but is also demanded by the Constitution, which is basically the Consolidated Fund Services. Now it reduced in the year 2024-25, basically the change, but that's obviously because, as you can see, the quantum of payments for interest, which is much, much higher than the redemption of debt, the bottom part D of this. So you can see of which interest E is 1 trillion in 2025-26, the current budget year. Redemption of debt would be about 804 billion, and pensions, of course, are 247 billion lower than it was in the previous year. So it's also telling you that, fine, the fiscal pressure has been there, but now, while revenues in total are 3.3 trillion, expected revenues are 3.3 trillion, a total of 2 trillion is going to be used to actually service the debt. So here is basically the fiscal crisis that we talk about, the fiscal distress. And what that means is Cabinet Secretary Mbadi is not entirely wrong to state that an occasion exists in which government is facing tight fiscal pressures. Now, whether that adjustment requires the reduction of a constitutionally mandated payments regarding education is, I think, the question being debated, and which we hope to highlight today. Now, one other thing that comes feeding from the last one is, as you can see here from this table, we are stating that the nominal interest payments have grown 81% in 5 years. So if you look at this, from 2018, interest payments were 370 billion. Now, these are nominal numbers. We haven't corrected them for inflation, but I'll do that in a while. So you can see that it's grown from 370 billion to 1 trillion over 2025 and 2026. That's basically 8-year range that we cover here. But in between 2024 and 2025 and the present financial year alone, it has grown by another 10%. Of course, redemption has grown, has reduced by 23%, but on the total, public debt service, total public debt service has been much higher than what you saw as the total expenditure on education, and by far on education. So the interest payments on education alone for 2025 comes down to nearly 1.1 trillion. And yet the total amount being spent on education for that year is 700 billion. So interest alone basically are almost 40% higher than what is being spent on education service in total, not just basic education. That's every place of education, including grants, tertiary education, TVETs, and all of basic education, including university funding. And so that's basically what this is supposed to tell us. And the major driver of this payments in the consolidated funds account is basically just debt. So in a way, if you look at the consolidated fund services as a share of GDP, which is close to the bottom, I mean the row right at the bottom, it's usually been in the 10 to 11% range. Last year was particularly atrocious at 13%. This year is at 11%. And part of the reason is not necessarily that it's reduced. Part of the reason is that the external debt component, quotient of the total debt that is being redeemed this year, has been moderated substantially by the strength of the Kenyan shilling. So otherwise it would still be, would have been in the 11 or 13% of GDP range, which is obviously 3 percentage points of GDP higher than it was in the year 2018, as shown by this. So let's go on the other side, basically what has grown. If you look at the growth of non-discretionary expenditure, remember the non-discretionary expenditure, including penny bills, if you put it down as a percentage of GDP. Now, this is World Bank calculations, staff calculations, and it's a report from the National Treasury, the same one that we've been talking about here. It shows us a trend line over those years, and all those bars are divided by color, telling you two things. One, the major thing coming to 2022 and 2023 is development expenditure has been shrinking from 7.9% to 3.4%. And interest payments have risen as a share of GDP to 5.2%, right? So interest payments started in 2010 at 2% of GDP. Remember, GDP has been growing as well. It's 5.2% interest payments alone. Transfers to counties has shrunk, as you can tell, from about 3.4 to 2.4. So part of that fiscal adjustment that government has needed to make because of the pressures, try to persuade you, driven by the debt servicing costs, have been borne substantially by, or to a large extent, by three areas. One, wages and salaries, which has grown from 7.2 to 4.9% of GDP. County endowments transferred to counties, which was 3.4 and came down to 2.4, a full percentage point difference between 2013 to 2023, which is basically 10 years. And that's big, remembering that the GDP has been growing over time. And also, of course, part of the shrinkage of operations and maintenance over that period. Wages and salaries as well. But in the whole, what this tells you is basically how government budgets have changed. And as the budget shrinks and the flexibility reduces, more often than not, the part that actually gets, the part that has actually grown is servicing interest component of debt. Every other thing has stayed constant, but obviously the shrinkage and the biggest adjustment has taken place on the part of county governments, and obviously wages and salaries, which have been fairly are reduced by a big portion. If you place spending bills on top, spending bills by county governments, which is that small box at the end, which is dotted line at the end, you can tell. So it's telling you growth of non-discretionary expenditure has actually been quite large, growing from 20% and over time peaking at about 25% in 2016 and 17. And then obviously it stayed at the same course. I mean, more or less reduced, but if you look at it, if you added the pending bills by national government and the pending bills by county governments, which should place non-discretionary expenditure, then we have really, so it's not as if government has been spending less. It's just that government has actually responded to the fiscal crisis by delaying the pending bills, both at national government level, but the pending bills by county government. So really, again, what this tells you is that county governments are not the cause of this explosion in spending or fiscal expansion that we've seen. And then coming to the majority of pending bills as well, they are held by state corporations. As you can tell here, total spending bills as a share of GDP is 4.3%. It peaks at 5.2 in 21, basically adjustment to COVID, 5.1, and it's been coming down and settled at 4.3%, of which MDS, which is ministries, departments, and agencies of government, hold 136 billion. 380 billion are held by state corporations. And then, of course, county governments at 182, which is actually a little higher, but the share as a total is not as large. So basically what it's telling us here is state corporations are the major drivers of the pending bills held by the public sector in Kenya. Now we're about to finish, so we're going back to what's the crisis. I think the crisis tells you very, very clearly there's no fiscal headroom. So to the extent that using an accounting method, looking at those methods, looking at the numbers and the flexibility available in the budget, CS Badi comes and presents to the nation the fact that, look, we have no fiscal headroom. He is correct. Those numbers demonstrate to us that there's not much flexibility in the budget as they existed. So there's a compounding problem that the fiscal space is becoming more rigid, and government, obviously, the share of pending bills growing, telling you that there's forwarding of bills into the future and delaying payments to private sector and firms that have supplied governments at all levels, but primarily driven primarily driven by state corporations. So that's one thing to note. Interest payments are growing at a faster rate than revenues have grown. Now, government's fiscal consolidation efforts, which we've been with that for about 6-7 years, right? It looks like it's the attempt to actually generate the attempt to actually undertake fiscal consolidation by leading to revenues, by trying to raise revenues faster than the debt is growing, led to generational protests last year. And in my view, our view rather, it established a a political economy constraint on how much government can raise taxes. Not only because it was very difficult times for people and household incomes already affected, the communication of that tax adjustments were very brazen, very arrogant, and led to that. But the third point is the political economy constraint was raised by people saying, look, we are not prepared to give more money to a government that is trusted, but also at the same time, the pains of that adjustment would have been too tough for households. So that's the fiscal revenue model. Fiscal consolidation that was revenue-led partly led to that. And I think there's a break in how much government can adjust taxes in the short term. But transfers to state corporations still form a large part of recurrent expenditure. And recurrent expenditure obviously tells you how government redistributes income within the redistributes income revenues and within the broader public sector. So the interest payments and needs of the state-owned corporations compete with social spending. And we think that this is one of the things that Badi didn't give us an option of. Of course, Parliament, in our view, is being disingenuous by saying that, look, we have not done anything to allow the CS to speak as it is. To be honest, they're being disingenuous. They've been underfunding education, especially education, primary education, where the capitation grants are really, really modest. 600 billion. 600 billion is just 10% of a day's collection. 680 million is just 10% of one day's government collection. Less than 10% of one day's government collection. So if they really wanted to fund basic primary education in full, it is not a big thing. It's not onerous, regardless of what fiscal crisis we're facing. We can speak about what it means for high school, because of course the capitation is much, much higher. But on the whole, the fact that you're cutting you're cutting government spending or subvention for primary schools on the basis of an acute crisis is one that did not start because of the debt problem. It's actually been a systematic neglect of primary education funding for a very, very long time. And we are seeing that while that is happening, state corporations are being allowed to expand the debt, but also to expand their own spending. And we are therefore claiming that the interest payments and needs of state corporations is competing in social spending, and social spending is losing badly. As I conclude, So our key message is basically, we understand that Parliament has an obligation under Article 43 to appropriate funds for basic education. We think there's no flexibility around that. It means that this should actually dominate public spending. And with the public having established a political economic constraint on education, it means Parliament needs to apply its minds to how to redistribute cash from other non-priority expenditures. And non-priority in our view is anything that the Constitution did not specifically protect. Basic education is protected. The conversations by the CS illustrate the pressure of the fiscal crisis. But we think that basic education also has a problem of pork barrel. Basically, how money is distributed. We looked at the basic education, and perhaps that will be that definitely will be an argument when we look at the budgets known and ask ourselves how they might be rearranged. It is true that there's a fiscal constraint to how much money government can raise, how much government can borrow, given this time. And so big adjustments need to be made within the budget itself, which is basically part of what it needs to cut, but also what it needs to distribute from one and the other. So we found out under the basic education, for instance, the basic education budget lines, we went into the budget program-based budgets and the budget lines, and we found out that basic education is charged quite a lot of money, going in my estimation to about 2 billion shillings every year. Yes, which is higher than the underfunding. Slightly less than 2 billion. Let me be careful with that claim. Slightly less than 2 billion, or let me just say the amount that we could actually close the funding gap at primary education level. And that goes to, one, there's an educational attaché or an educational role for somebody in Brussels, in New Delhi, in the US, in India, in New Delhi, in Brussels, in Cape Town, and all these, as we tried to find out, because the education, it's not clear, officers helping government Kenya to coordinate education policy and to coordinate students in those places for Kenyan students. And that's a really, really good thing. But whether that should be charged on the account of basic education is worrying for us, because that's a tertiary education question in my view. So unless these roles are specifically expanded, there's about 8 or 9 officers sitting up there, and they have officers. So it's not just an officer being funded. They have other activities related to their roles. And I'm not really, really sure what basic education coordination is required at global level or at certain chosen embassies for those officers. Now, whether those officers are required to exist or not, we think there might be a justification, but that justification should come through the funding for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and not through the Ministry of Education. So we are not too sure about that. And those have been not touched. They've actually been growing, suggesting to me that they have a very stable place in the education line. We also saw the unequal treatment of schools. So in addition to the fact that we have schools, and you've seen the underfunding throughout the basic education value chain, and this includes junior school and also high school in general, the amount of money and capitation that the government of Kenya provides to schools is very unequal. So some schools barely get enough to be able to do. In fact, the policy has tried to nudge schools that are too small to be closed because, of course, their basic costs, their marginal costs are high. But there are also other schools that get, in addition to the capitation grant per student, their boarding schools and boarding facilities are being supported by the government. We think that is inequitable, especially seeing the difference in the quality of classrooms, in the quality of facilities that schools bear in Kenya. So that might be something that also needs for Parliament to look at. Again, we think that school vouchers are a solution to ghost schools and fraud. Now, we all know, and it's been reported in the press in verifiable ways, and obviously some of these matters are in court, some are being investigated, that clever people, knowing the government sends grants to schools on the basis of the capitation, went, registered schools that are not real schools, and by that are actually appropriating government grants as private individuals, where schools don't even exist. So the schools don't even exist. And that tells us that it's both a peculiar problem, because the Ministry of Education supposedly has the GPS and the geographical indications, geographical coordinates of every school in the country. So how a clever individual could actually go out there and establish a school and ensure that they have the right credentials? First, establishing a school in Kenya requires a lot. The registration process is very onerous. We saw some of it. So how this happens in our view tells us that there's something really, really broken at the Ministry of Education and the Treasury itself. So one of the things that we think about is this kind of fraud is based on the fact that government tends to fund schools. In our interpretation, the constitutional requirement is the right belongs to the child. So a voucher system, which means all Kenyan students are registered and they have a unique number. So that should be activated on the basis of where the student goes to. So a school voucher doesn't mean necessarily that the voucher should provide cash, but we have systems of sending cash and cash equivalents directly to households. And I think because these students have guardians and they're registered, maybe that's one way to handle it, so that government is clear that the funding and the capitation component goes directly to a student where they have been registered in a school, and not necessarily first by finding a school, because then it means that the right actually and the capitation is going to the school, and the students then have to follow the schools. In my view, it would have to go, it should, a voucher system would actually solve part of these ghost schools and the fraud problem that goes with the capitation. And that would require the registration NEMIS functionality, which has registered every child. Now, how that can be done through biometrics, maybe that's a political decision that needs to be made, and a social and cultural argument that we would, whether Kenyans are prepared to have their fingerprints available in a government system for kids. That's debatable, but nevertheless, there's a way to actually identify every child based on the unique number credentials, so that is what should trigger where the money should go, and not necessarily because a school exists and therefore it is entitled to grants. I think we also think about the teacher numbers. So if you look at government estimates, and the World Bank report that we spoke to you about today talks about the teacher numbers in Kenya, we seem to be arguing in Kenya that there's a permanent teacher shortage, and maybe there is. But one of the things that we find difficult to process is that there are 400,000 plus teachers in the public education system. I mean, right? Therefore, 4 out of every 10 employees of the public sector are teachers. And when you see the big claims about how many some schools, which don't have just classrooms, but are also underfunded, are rather under-resourced in terms of the teaching part, and especially what part more than 50% of the spending on education appropriated through teachers' wages, we really need to actually ask whether all those teachers exist and the payroll integrity. Why? Because that's both an efficiency question, but it's a human resource management question, because we cannot resolve the conundrum or the problem of funding, which through an accounting argument, which Cabinet Secretary Mbadi presented eloquently in our view. His numbers were largely correct because of the underfunding. We cannot resolve that without asking ourselves, the biggest part of education spending goes through the TSC, representing the HR component. That HR component is close to 50, I mean, more than 50% of the total spending. I think we need to be clear about the payroll integrity and to ensure that all those teachers are there. So a census or some mechanism to prove that is essential, because there are other publications showing, well, this was about maybe slightly close to a decade ago, that there might have been as much as 15,000 ghost teachers in Kenya. I think this needs to be resolved. And you're not resolving the question by simply talking about cutting the capitation, which is fine, if that's what is required. Not fine, actually, but that's a shortcut. And we're actually going for the weakest part of it. Kids will miss school, especially at primary school level, without asking ourselves whether the efficiency of the total spending in the education sector can be improved, and we are persuaded that it can. Thank you.
So thanks to both Leo, Kemboi, and Kwame for taking us through this. I mean, providing some facts around the debate on basic education with regard to the question of whether it's a sustainability issue or it's a question to do with the cost of government. And indeed, what you've shown that is that whereas obviously the arguments, important arguments, and obviously that constitutional obligation in terms of the right to education and in terms of providing resources, government providing resources towards basic education. The two things obviously that you've shown that whereas it's not a public good, but it has externalities, positive externalities that are public, and obviously the benefits that accrue from education in terms of labor mobility, income mobility, and others. And the fact, obviously, that the benefit in terms of public spending is equitable, meaning that across the different income groups, its benefits actually accrue to the highest actually on the poor. So there are all these positives, positive impact that and benefits that will arise from ensuring that resources are put towards basic education, and obviously the power that Parliament has. So looking at all this, what you've shown us is that this debate, more than ever before, is important, and obviously the reality of the stress that this education sector has been facing, given that, of course, yes, there's been systemic underfunding, which obviously hasn't started today, and also the fact that interest payment, which is a compulsory spending, is actually displacing spending on social sector, and particularly on education. So you're providing that reality and the factual fact that indeed the distress that the country, fiscal distress that the country is experiencing, is one of the things that is affecting spending and even capitation towards basic education. And also you provided facts that yes, there may be some other things that may be done within the education sector in terms of reallocation of resources, just to ensure that capitation to secondary education does not, does not suffer. Basically, capitation does not suffer, because you've shown that obviously TSE of all the different components, the component that has been going to TSE is what has been growing. So yeah, so that's basically my take with regard to this debate. And now we have an opportunity to discuss this further, and for you as participants to ask any question in case something was not clear, or if you have any comment or whatever critique that you may have. So what we'll do, I already see we have a hand. I don't see any questions so far in the chat box, but feel free to utilize that platform as well. So what I'll do is we'll have 2 rounds of question and answer. So we'll start with this round. The hand that I see is from, is it Ayodo? Yeah, please unmute yourself. You can introduce yourself and pose your question. So you mention who you'd like to direct it to between the 2 speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
I tried putting my question in the chat box, but it was not giving me space to go do that. But I have a few comments I want to make. One is on the last comment by Kwame on the staffing. I think the TSE and the Ministry of Education needs to style up on the staffing norms so that we get the staff numbers right, but also address the issue of mode of delivery. Are we going to continue the same method of delivery when the numbers and the technology has come in? So that's one thing they need to look at. 2, on the basic education budget, if you look at what you have shared on the TSE and the capitation, I want to think that majority of the teachers are employed in the basic education sector. So that budget for me is still under basic education. Then the 3rd comment is on data integration, where we are looking at the reliability of the data in the NEMIS, given that as a country, our coverage on birth registration is not 100%. So the challenge around there is, and if you look at the corruption index, it can tell you where the problem is. We are creating an avenue for people to go to the national birth registration to meet the requirement for registration in the schools, and we are not at 100%. So while children in school, they have not been registered in the system to get their numbers for capitation. But on the 4th issue is on leakages. I think if the Ministry of Education was to be realistic, they should address leakages. capitation is just one avenue of raising revenue. In the schools, they are raising revenue through remedial, through uniform charges, exam, and there is also a bit of leakage in the procurement system and compliance. And this, I think the Auditor General is not doing, they are not doing their mandate as far as auditing the schools. What they have given the public is just what they call a spot check. So the Auditor General has failed the country in terms of auditing all resources that are going to schools, so that we get to know what is it that we are raising outside the capitation, because all along we are talking about capitation. And one of the other areas of leakage is also infrastructure, funded by the ministry, at the same time funded by the parents. So that needs to be looked at. On the rights, for me, my take has been the same way we have done for other sectors, whether health, whether housing, whether roads. We need to consider introducing tax for education. Then on the
Ayodi, final question, so that we can allow the others to also raise their question.
Yeah, I have just one more.
Okay.
One more is on education planning in Kenya. And because a child who is born registered and who has a basic right to education is known by government at birth. So why then can't we make adequate provisions based on birth registration of the numbers that are born, so that 10 years down the line, we don't tell these children we cannot educate? Thank you.
Thank you, Ayodi. So I hope Kwame and Kembo, you've made a note of those questions. So let me see. I saw another hand. Is it from Florence or?
It's Francis.
Francis, yeah. Francis,
Yes.
please.
My background is in corporate governance, and I feel like that is a topic that has been quietly ignored when it comes to education in Kenya, especially at the level of both pre-primary, primary, and secondary education. And here you're talking about stakeholders, because the government is just one. The government is just a what we call a shareholder. But in terms of, because of that lack of a model or a framework for corporate governance for these schools, then what it means is that other stakeholders are put aside, and the government is the one that dictates everything. So in this case, you find the government wants to dictate even a simple thing like revenue measures, as the previous speaker said. So when the government tells the school that you cannot raise any other financing apart from what we are giving you as a grant or as capitation, then it puts the corporate governance of the school at risk, because now how does the school do its budget? How does the school involve other stakeholders? So I think we need to return back to the basics of corporate governance, especially at our institutions, because without schools having appropriate budget and appropriate revenue mechanisms, then it means we are putting everyone at the other stakeholders at risk. So I don't. One of the failings I've seen with the Ministry of Education is that we have the acts of parliament, but we do not have a policy. We do not have a single policy that tells us what does the government want to, what is the policy objective of these acts of parliament. So I hope the speakers will address these issues of corporate governance, and that was my contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. So we also have Kisimbi Thomas.
Hi. So thank you for the insightful presentation on the education sector and on capitation. I think, as always, you guys always kind of do some really good stuff here. So I wonder, given the discussion that we had, I'm sorry, I'm coughing. Given Kenya's kind of existing challenges with delayed and also inadequate capitations, right, on the disbursement challenges that we had, right, it would be good to just kind of maybe get a good sense of, even within those capitations that are actually inadequate, how much of that is vested in ghost schools, right? and other kind of type of waste, where if you actually did a better job at being more efficient and more effective in how these disbursements are made, and what additional impact this could have, right? Because one mechanism that Kwame suggested was around the voucher system. And we've seen the voucher system in other settings defund public schools. They tend to kind of increase inequality, which is a strong highlight of our public kind of funding of our public education in primary and secondary schools. And so then seeing a reversal of that actually might be detrimental to our overall equity system that we want to perpetuate here. So I'm curious in terms of whether this was a serious suggestion in terms of what we want to do, especially given the fact that the voucher system solves maybe for the ghost schools. But I also suggest that if a government or people are intent on pillaging public coffers, they'll do so even with a voucher system. And then this voucher system also has these detrimental effects of inequality. And so I'm just curious in terms of whether this is one that we should seriously consider, or at least look at how implementable it is to protect it from misuse, quality gaps, defining of public systems, and administrative inefficiencies that we expect that might have with such a system.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks for that, Thomas. We'll also have another round. So for now, I'd like to give this opportunity to our speakers. So what we'll do is we'll start with I know majority of the questions are to Kwame, but we'll start with Leo. So Leo, just pick any of these questions and speak to, and then we can have Kwame respond thereafter.
I'll answer question from Ayodo, and the question from Ayodo was on the question of so he asked four questions, which is the consideration about numbers and mode of delivery, whether that needs to be considered. One thing that you notice from the budget is that if you compare, if you take out secondary and primary education in terms of numbers, the cheapest one provided is primary education. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, and even the net enrollment is the highest. And the second part is on secondary. If you look at the secondary, because net enrollment is something like 86%, but for secondary education, it's 48%. And that tells you an issue about mode of delivery, because largely most primary schools are boarding. Most primary schools are not boarding schools, and secondary schools are boarding schools, and it raises that cost, and this ties to the question that Gisimbi asked, which is whether vouchers would increase inequality. One of the things that we've seen from the data, and from this data, and even though we did not mention, is that on the capitation basis, if you look at the way the capitation is issued, it does not take account of any school uniqueness. So the capitation system as it is today has made better schools more better, and has made schools that are not that are worse off in terms of infrastructure, in terms of teachers, more worse. And that also speaks to, again, to the delocalization plan. How teachers are distributed. Majority of Kenyan teachers are within follow urban areas, townships, and major townships, but the far-flung areas do not have teachers. So there is an equity problem, even as it is that Kizimbi that you claim it, and the vouchers vouchers will create. It won't. And let me leave that question Kwame will address. On the question of planning element, what the biggest takeaway that we like you to take from this is the fiscal pressures, the infrastructure-led debt binge that Kenya went on, actually has resulted into a fiscal crisis. And that fiscal crisis is converging with the question of is converging with the with now a bulging population that requires to be educated. So there's nothing called planning. There's nothing on the planning element. What would have happened and would have given government of Kenya to headroom is if their expenditures had been disciplined, there would be no problem as it is today. The problem is that expenditures were not disciplined, And that fiscal crisis is that they're looking at everything and realizing that we can't be sending 10 billion shillings, that 12 billion shillings on capitation every month to schools. And they have to delay it, and that you close a financial year and they've not even sent close to 30% of what was owed in the last financial year. And that's a problem. So it's a fiscal, we're just highlighting a problem, how fiscal pressure is showing up in public services. So I don't see the planning element should come from fiscal policy, not on the other side, and which is we need something sort of a debt break or something else that is that solves the debt problem. Let me allow Kwame to answer the others.
Thanks, Leo. So Ayodo, yes, staffing norms and modes of delivery, yes, but those are content questions that are delivered about how the teaching is done. The Teacher Service Commission should not just deploy teachers. I think the responsibility for curriculum is on its delivery, and the effectiveness of that spending is something that Parliament should be putting the Teacher Service Commission to task for. I don't think they do enough, because whenever we see the Teacher Service Commission presenting fantastic proposals about how there's a teacher shortage, Parliament usually responds just generally by distribution comments about how teachers are deployed, but usually differs to them by giving them those numbers. But we need to ask, given the investment that is being made already, what are the outcomes? And I think the disciplining of teachers is a big problem in this country. It's a fringe problem, but it's a very permanent problem, which I don't think the Teacher Service Commission does enough, judging from the outside on. It might be constrained by the power of the teachers union, but nevertheless, if you are spending 1 billion shillings per day in Kenya, you are bigger than half of the corporations on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. I mean, actually, virtually all of the corporations on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. So your responsibility for the quality of the staff and how they deal with quote unquote the students that are under their charge is something that I think the Teacher Service Commission should do a much better job on, and Parliament should call them to, and I don't think they do that enough. So that's the first thing about the model delivery. Ayodo was talking about something that's really dangerous. This idea that every sector of the economy or that the public sector should have its own earmarked tax. I mean, I'm surprised that you mentioned the housing levy. It's a fantastic example of how not to try and fund public education. Partly because, as you can tell, that money is not even being circulated. It's now being kept in funds. I mean, kept in treasury bills. So government is taking your taxes from you and me, lending itself, and then paying itself an interest on it. And yet the houses that we were promised are actually not being constructed. In addition to that, we have compared at the Institute of Economic Affairs. You should see some of our analysis, the quality and the cost of housing being completed by the government against also the private sector. And the government is doing a really, really poor job. One other thing that you need to also understand is by earmarking a specific tax for education, you need to ask yourself, then what are we paying taxes for? If you have to earmark an additional tax specifically for education. That's just a claim for advancing government spending. which I think is a bad idea, and perhaps you should reconsider it. We can have a conversation around it a little bit later. And it's also a reflection of pork barrel, which is what will happen when people suddenly start to say, look, we will maintain ourselves on the basis of these taxes, and we have a special tax for education. There's no precedent for it in any other part of the world. I'm not too sure that it would be a good innovation for us to start with that in the end. How all resources should be audited. We think actually that the Auditor General's office in Kenya does a fantastic job. It's actually, in our view, one of the most effective offices in Kenya. Does it have faults? It does. But if you consider the effectiveness of public services in Kenya, the Auditor General's office is one. And we're not concentrating on individuals, we're concentrating on the Auditor General's office. When you read their reports, they're very careful. Most of the time, they're very meticulously done. But they also have shortages in terms of the responses to their queries from the other from the ministries, departments, and agencies, which actually delay those reports. And so if they had more resources and more people, they'll probably be able to carry out more and go into in-depth. I have a problem with the view that that schools should be able to collect more money from, because we know the abuse that happens through headmasters collecting more money is something that was sought, and it's what free primary education or the capitation is supposed to stop, by making sure that schools are fully funded. If there's any reason for that funding to additional funding to come from parents, then in my view, it should actually be managed much better than schools do it. I mean, the budgeting in schools and the quality of feedback that actually schools give in this country, given that they're very big public service, is also a problem. So yes, we need to solve the problem from both sides, but I'm not too sure that the government of Kenya is incapable of, based on the resources that already exist, to actually fully fund schools and make headmasters not fundraisers for schools, but just managers of the resources that have already come from the public sector. Francis, you talked about the corporate governance. I had thought that the Ministry of Education has specifically requirements, basically, which is one, how school boards are not just inducted, how they are appointed, and what their specific roles are relative to the management of schools, and how parents are in there. I mean, parents are integrated into that. Maybe there's something that needs to be done, perhaps a handbook or a form of training for parents to be able to be involved. I mean, to be more certainly involved and actually take more decisions is clear, because like you perhaps are concerned, I'm also concerned that principals in general have more authority, usually even in the social circles. So very few teachers are capable, especially in the public sector. Very few parents are capable of actually challenging them and maintaining, and that challenge actually leading to good outcomes. So yes, strengthening parents' associations, I think, is a useful thing. And that's one of the things that the private associations, we have one for private associations in private sector schools. I think we should have one perhaps for public sector schools. But looking at public sector schools and how they're governed in general, not just on the financial side, but just even how they treat kids. I mean, every time you see a child that's been named, it tends to be mostly from the public sector. So I agree with you about the standards and the corporate governance. But that is something that the responsibility should come from the public, from government, especially the Ministry of Education to do. Kisimbe, I think I see your genuine concern. Yes, in the US, people have argued that whenever you have voucher funding, it defunds public schools by allowing people to move, or students to move from private schools and go to, from public schools and go to private schools, and therefore underfunded private schools. A voucher system is effective for two things. One, solving Kenya's problems of ghost schools, which we've talked about. At the same time, it would be giving agency to parents, because the school in which they actually register their kids is the one that would receive that funding. So it would provide an incentive, or invert it by providing an incentive for schools to actually, one, treat parents better, but also to provide services, because if they don't, the real bearer of that grant, right, is the private sector. Is the parent or households, and households will therefore have more power in questioning schools about how schools are run, in addition to student performance, which is a big deal for public schools in Kenya. Now, defunding public schools is not a problem, in my view, that I view would happen in Kenya, because while the right to education has been provided for free and free basic education has been provided in the Constitution on Article 57, the interpretation that we Kenyans have, it's not been tested in court, is that means that free education is actually only an obligation of government for public schools. So what that means that capitation grants are actually only provided to public schools in Kenya. So if that interpretation holds, then it means that regardless of how much the capitation is and who bears it, parents only can activate it or appropriate that benefit only through a public school. And it will put public schools in competition with each other. And if some public schools die because another public school is performing better with the same capitation grant, then so be it. As it is right now, public schools in Kenya, some of them are being closed for being too small. So when they're too small, there might be an incentive in the board and those who manage it to try and generate numbers. That's the demand side, and at the same time to supply a service within the school that will incentivize more parents to actually forward that. So yes, I understand your concept. It cannot be blind, but if we have it conditional on the fact that you can only go to a private school, public school, then obviously the idea that there'd be leakage away from public schools is reduced. But also, if a public school is unable to attract students, then that's more evidence. I mean, the best evidence that we have that the quality of services we can provide, or for some reason they're inconvenient, and parents have decided to vote with their feet by enrolling children in other schools. And that provides an incentive for them to compete, because most public schools, to be honest, have captured regions or have captured a specific locale, and are for that reason assured of the grant going to them regardless of how they perform or how they treat their students generally. So I think that that's one mechanism that we do that. But the competition effect, I think, is important. And also if it clarifies that by reducing ghost schools, because it's unlikely that you can actually get 100 or 200 parents to register their kids not receiving education, but direct a fund to one specific person. That's not. So yes, they're not perfect solutions, but in my view, a voucher system helps. One, it's consistent with what the Constitution says. Who's the right bearer? The right bearer is actually the child, and not necessarily the school. We should think that. So schools need to be competing for students to be enrolled in them by providing the best services possible for the grant that is for the capitation grant. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So as Kwame and Leo prepares their final remarks, I see two. So this is a final round of questions. So I see Ayodo's hand is up, and two additional. So maybe Ayodo, you can quickly
Yes.
pose whatever questions or comments that you may have. Yeah, then I will read the ones that are on the chat box.
Thank you. I wanted to react to the issue of the governance, and I think the pertinent issue here is that the law requires that the ministry gazettes board of management, and you may audit and find out, and they have 3 years term renewable ones. This area is gray. You may look for the gazette notices for the basic education, and if you find it, please share with me on the gazettement of the boards, because then that is compromises the governance. The issue of the budget you're talking about, schools run without approved budgets. And so if the money we are pumping in is not being oversighted well at the basic education level, despite the structures that are in place and non-compliance, that's why I talked about compliance as being an issue that needs to be addressed. But I want to go back to my other issue. Kwame, you seem to have missed my point. My issue was we have leakages, and the leakages are schools charging remedials, which in some reports is about 50 billion a year for work that they're employed to do. We have issues about uniforms, school collecting money from parents for uniform to the tune of 35,000 per student in some of the national schools. We have schools charging exam fee for exams that should be administered within the school, and the teachers have a duty to set and mark exams. Then we have issues of procurement, that some of these schools, majority of their budget goes into procurement, but compliance to procurement regulations is one thing. And then there's the issue of the quality assurance, which you may want to dig into the budget of the ministry and determine how much money is set aside for quality assurance as opposed to what they are supposed to quality assure in terms of volumes of money amounts of money. But the other thing that I raised on the issue of the Auditor General is that the Auditor General has failed the country, and I'm very clear on this, in terms of auditing the education sector, because there's a lot of money that is being put, but as opposed, because if one school budget gets a budget of 150,000, a million in a year, and this school for the last 10 years or 15 years has not been audited by the Auditor General, and you can do your cross-check, because this is where the governance issue comes in, that we allow one sector to get more resources and play around with the lives of our children, yet the accountability is weak, both in terms of oversight, audit, and because the audit that were released is an indicator of a problem. So before we say we are underfunding, what is it that, because the audit would include these leakages that I've talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayodo. Points well taken. Of course, both the speakers will again react to what you've mentioned. So I'll quickly go through. I think there's some two comments in the chat box. They're a bit long, but I think there are questions and a comment. But so I'll start off with Kisimbi's. So Kisimbi mentions that notes that there was mention of concern about the perceived iniquity of additional funding for national schools, arguing that it widens existing disparities. However, one would argue that these institutions often attract some of the most academically gifted students who may require enriched learning environments or tailored support. So how do we balance the need for equity across all schools with the imperative to nurture exceptional talent, especially when national schools might be uniquely positioned to deliver that, or we at least have the highest probability of finding these students in such schools, ceteris paribus. So that's from Kisimbi. Then Kimutai, so I'm not sure whether these are comments, but basically Kimutai notes about 6, there is 7 or 8. Six, I guess it's an approach. Basically, maybe it's a comment on balancing equity and talent development in education. So what he notes is that for us, I mean, the balancing of equity and talent development in schools requires a multifaceted approach. So I'm not sure I'll read the entire, but basically he notes that for this to happen, there is the question of equitable funding. There is the question of ensuring that programs are well targeted, that national schools should offer programs for gifted schools while collaborating with the local schools to extend these opportunities. Then partnership, he notes that obviously partnership is key. The need to encourage resource sharing between national and local schools, including joint activities and teacher training. Component on inclusive talent identification. Scholarships obviously are important. Curriculum development. That obviously is inclusive in terms of ensuring that that design actually factors the challenge that gifted school students face. Then obviously the question of monitoring, and then number 8, community engagement. So what he notes is that these strategies can help nurture exceptional talent while promoting equity across all schools, and that this will help in terms of creating a more inclusive educational landscape. So thanks for that, Kimutai. Of course, the speakers may want to react to this or not, but thanks for that. Now, a quick rejoinder. I don't know what point. So Isimbi has sent another question. So I guess maybe more like a clarification. So the point he's trying to make is that for certain schools, We must make investment to nurture and identify gifted talent through our public funding architecture, which for some might seem inequitable. So I think that's a clarification he has made. Yeah, so I hope that's clear for both Kwame and Leo. So let's start with Leo so you can react to any of these final questions and comments, and then make your final remarks, and then we'll move on to Kwame. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with a question from Ayodo about leakages. So Ayodo, there are many specialized audits on the Auditor General's website. If you see one of the charts that we referred to, actually came from the Auditor General's evaluation, and they've evaluated all manner of things, including some of the issues that you've raised. I know where the weakness is on the procurement side, because the Auditor General just uses sampling to review procurement audits. But we've raised and reiterated that all manner of leakages are significant problems in education sector, and that we don't discount those questions about leakages. We also need to, what we call free basic education is actually fees free. It's fees free, but the other things that people buy from uniforms and many other things. So you cannot. So that's a challenge. But the bigger part that a conversation needs to happen, and now I think starting from what the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury raised, is that part of this needs to continue. Part of this discussion around efficiency needs to continue. Back to Kisimbi's point about, so let me give an example. One national school received a grant of 75 million outside appropriations, outside capitation. 75 million is equivalent to capitation under the current rate of 16,000 for more than 4,600 students. Now we make the argument for gifted. So there's a trade-off, and trade-off is other children would miss schooling. Other children will miss schooling, and that's why there's an argument, and even the Auditor General identified that question of rationing. So is rationing, if you look at Article 53 of the Constitution on basic and compulsory education, is rationing one of the scenarios that was anticipated? I don't think so. If you look at questions about discrimination, whether some children get better education and others do not, is that something? It isn't, and that's why you see from the net enrollment rate for secondary education is almost half of primary education. So that's a challenge. So we can't make such kind of a decision in the name of gifted to now undermine the principle of access, because access is what the Constitution required, and that access, that mandatory access, is something that needs to be enforced before other policy objectives take precedence of that. So we recognize that issue, and that's why I think the next debate that should happen is whether we need boarding schools for secondary education, where only half of the number net enrollment is almost half of the national of primary school access. So I don't think those two things go hand in hand. And there must be a deliberation. If it's about access, then access needs to be resolved. It needs to be resolved. So the big question, as I wind up now, it's to remind National Treasury that suggestions from the executive are not funding decisions. If the Treasury thinks it's unsustainable, they can make a suggestion, but Parliament needs to make a suggestion. And Parliament, as the representative body for the people of Kenya, should make a decision, should deliberate on this question of sustainability and ensure that they're able to fund secondary education more equitable, and in a way that allows almost universal access for the entire basic education, especially at the secondary level. Because where there is a problem, and as Mbadi identifies it correctly, is it's not sustainable. Government cannot pay for it. In the last 4 years, in the 23-24 financial year alone, 30 billion was unfunded. That is rationing, and so the rationing is mostly for those households that cannot access private education, and so that system is brutal, and it's not just because it's generational. Because once somebody fails to go through school today, there's an implication for the kind of wages they would earn, pensions, just the entire livelihood of an individual. So a more equitable system that government can fund needs to be discussed, and the primary thing should be 100% access at secondary level. So I wind at that and comment.
All right. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Leo. So I'll go through the questions and hope to. So Ayodo, you're right about leakages. Of course, leakages need to be resolved, whether it's public sector money or whether it's contribution from the parents. So I defer you to your clarification about what you were speaking about. So thanks a lot about that. Whether the government gazettes the board of management for every school, I think that's something we need to check, and we'll need to find out. Now, you know, okay, so when I was in high school, my parents and I, or rather, we had my family moved from one big city, Nairobi, to another city in the west of Kenya, another town in the west of Kenya. It was in Kisumu. And one of my parents was a lawyer and had a client who was an education psychologist, and determined that my brother and I would be extremely gifted squash players. And so our parents bought us equipment, and we had like a small coach. We'd go to a certain club and play. Whether we are gifted or not is a different matter. We won a few prizes. I mean, I'm an economist and not a squash player. So if you tell me that giftedness is the basis for government to discriminate, I find that difficult to accept. So you can tell how giftedness can go in very many ways. Squash is as much an intellectual game as it is a physical. But I'm not too sure that the government of Kenya should have been paying for me to become an elite squash player, which I think we'd have done a decent thing for. And the reasons they made that was by measuring. They said these guys were gangly, we had long arms, we were not fat, and we were very quick and had quick reflexes. That would make us squash players. And probably they were right. So this idea in Kenya that some people are entitled to better education and discrimination because we have determined through an exam as basic at KCPE that they are special people and therefore more gifted than others, I disagree with it fundamentally. And I think it has been used for elite capture, and it's been used to justify government discrimination against certain places. Because even geographically, most national schools until more recently were based in certain places, which were cooler, the highlands of Kenya and the west of Kenya in a place called Maseno and thereabouts. Very cool places without that kind of weather, which was favored by white settlers because of those weather conditions. We cannot, 60 years after independence, be using public money to support a colonial project which was specifically to pick people and place them in specific places and call them special. I disagree fundamentally with that. And so, regardless of how qualified a student is, I do not think that the government of Kenya should support one child more than the other by taking an arbitrary question of academic giftedness and deciding that that kind of giftedness should be supported with public money against other people. I don't agree with that claim. So let's come down to why I also disagree with it. Look, if you look at spending, the Constitution of Kenya and Article 53, which we read to you, says that every child is entitled to a basic, free and compulsory basic education. It does not qualify that by saying, but if they are gifted, government should discriminate against the others. So I have a problem fundamentally with that view, that we pick national schools in Kenya and decide, regardless of where they are there, are some of those kids gifted? Some are. I was not a gifted person. Well, I don't know if I was not gifted or not. I was, whatever, ended up where I am. You don't get to sit at the IEA if you're not gifted, especially in the work that we do. Some of us went to national schools, some of us did not. I disagree with that very arbitrary classification that some people should be given more public resources. If they are gifted, their parents should invest in them, and that's acceptable. Separate academies might be set and they can go there. The idea of using public money to support an arbitrary claim of giftedness, especially based on a standard 8 exam in Kenya or even a KCSE exam, is not acceptable to me and certainly fundamentally contradicts what the Constitution provides. So that's one. Finally, I think in the year 2011, 2014, we'll send this, a certain Kenyan who is an economist and works, I think, in a university in the Midwest, in the coastal universities in the US, assessed this question of national schools. And he found out that actually national schools are not peculiar. It is the students that they pick up that are peculiar. So those students would have thrived regardless of where they were. So we are maintaining an infrastructure through some kind of elite, like boarding schools and private schools that exist in the West and especially in the UK, and building a class structure on public money to chase ourselves with this view, to satisfy ourselves that we are doing that. So Kisimbi and Leonida, I disagree with you fundamentally. The question of introducing a qualification of giftedness to start to discriminate against schools, Leo has argued against it. And for me, it's not just morally wrong, it has no fiscal benefits that would confer, and it particularly reminds me of the worst parts of colonialism, which was to divide a society into the gifted and not, and to create a caste system. Now, whether people want to celebrate that they were educated in national schools or not, that is perfectly their right. But I don't want taxpayers, somebody in Siaya who can hardly afford a secondary school in the village, to be paying taxes to educate another person's child from Nairobi or from Kisumu who thinks themselves gifted. I disagree. That is not a policy that should have. And the sooner national schools are even abolished in this country, the better. Otherwise, parents should specifically pay for their kids to be educated. That is their right, but not at public expense. No. The other things that Leonida spoke about here are scholarships for talented students and whether we should have weighted funding. I still believe that the person that the Constitution protects, and our argument was the Constitution, that's why we limited ourselves all the way to basic education. We can discuss tertiary education, which is also important as part of completing that value chain. But tertiary education, in my view, should be funded entirely through loans. Basic education should be funded because the Constitution requires by government funds. Can it be done more efficiently? Certainly. And so appropriating sufficient funds to make sure that it is done is a responsibility of Parliament. And Mr. Mbadi or CS Mbadi is entitled to actually say, look, given the amount of money that Parliament has appropriated for this purpose, it is insufficient. For that reason, remember first that 22,225 was set in 16 or 2017, when it was first implemented, I think in 2018. So in those years, it's actually been eroded by inflation. And so by Parliament failing to index it to inflation in the first place, to make sure that it rises by inflation, to maintain the cost of that is part of the error that was made. And those errors have caught up with us now. And because of the strictness of Parliament, of public spending today, the crisis, we are finding that money being eroded more. But if we have the bad choice between letting kids not go to school and making sure that the grant is recalibrated to make sure everybody is covered, I think Mr. Mbadi is making a sensible argument. However, if as Parliament has done, and we've seen nobody no less than the leader of majority in Parliament saying that no, this is not something that we'll accept, then he needs to bring a bill in Parliament, either to cut from other places, I would suggest state corporations, or to actually bring in a new bill to raise money to fund the gap that Mr. Mbadi has identified. I hope this has been a useful conversation for you, and if you have other questions, we can answer them elsewhere. Thank you, John, and thanks a lot, everybody, for supporting IE work. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so that brings us to the end of this webinar. So help me appreciate both the two speakers, Kwame Owino and Leo Kemboi. Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, just to reiterate, this is it hasn't been posted, but we'll post this presentation right after this webinar, so you can interact with it some more. Otherwise, thanks a lot for joining us in this webinar, and we hope it's been useful and that it will enrich this discussion in terms of just grounding it with facts, and also in terms of what really the issues are, in terms of framing this whole debate about sustainability of funding for basic education. As we close, just to note that the Institute of Economic Affairs is a membership organization, and so if you'd like to be a member, please feel free to reach out to our communication team. That's Michelle and Oscar, or even just visit our website. I think those details are provided for in terms of the benefits and how to register to be a member. Otherwise, for many more of these current topical issues and other economic issues, so look out actually to our website and social media platforms for webinars and other discussions, or even whether it's blogs, research papers, and bulletins. Otherwise, thanks a lot, and have yourself